Hi, Dr. Scott Jensen here. When doctors, when doctors or scientists get it wrong, I think we need to talk about that a little bit. About 8 years ago, I released my first book. It's called Relationship Matters. And in this book, I made this comment. I have learned that lingering self-incrimination serves a valuable purpose by etching forever in my mind those occasions of flawed judgment. The luxury of forgetting is not a reprieve I seek. When I was talking about that specific story, I was referencing a young man who came in distress, responded well, and then backtracked. I was commenting on the fact that as a physician, in those moments where self-incrimination is very real, I need to hold on to it. I need to analyze it, and I need to ask myself, how can I make sure this never happens again? How can I better serve my patients going forward? I guess that's why we call it the practice of medicine. Then, in the last 8 months, I released this book, We've Been Played. I think one of the interesting things about this book is that when I was originally writing the book, the chapter title that I was going to use for chapter 13 was When We Get It Wrong. But I realized it really wasn't about when doctors get it wrong. Excuse me. I realized it wasn't about when we get it wrong. It was about when doctors get it wrong. And I changed that title because this is on us. So much of what's going on right now is on us. Both of these books can be purchased at drscottjensenbook.com. drscottjensenbook.com. But what I really want to talk about today is when doctors get it wrong. How do we walk it back? How do we get better? How do we come alongside of you and rebuild the trust? I think we need to go back and remember our sacred oath. And I would say, as much as the Hippocratic Oath is a huge part of who I am and who most physicians are, it's also primum non nocere, which is Latin for first, do no harm. And I'm going to come back to that again. Why sometimes is it difficult? Because we get blinded. We get blinded by our own normalcy bias. We see the world the way we see the world. And that blocks us sometimes from being better. And it shortchanges you, the patient. One of my favorite quotes, and we're living it these last 3 years, George Orwell, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. It seems like that's where we're at today. Telling the truth literally has become a revolutionary act, putting yourself potentially in harm's way. I have tried to be true to my intellectual integrity, and I've asked over and over again, is it a scam? Is it a scam? Pulling back the curtain. I think so often of the Wizard of Oz and the wizard pulling all those levers and sounding with that huge godlike voice. And then Toto the dog and Dorothy go over and they pull back the curtain and they see a mere mortal trying to act like a god. And I think also I've tried to draw attention to the fact that as we've moved through this pandemic, the notion of gouging the marketplace has played a very real role. And we can never forget that. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but I think we can know that the marketplace has been gouged. In 2002, SARS Corona 1 hit. There were some almost 10,000 cases around the world. almost 1,000 deaths. At that time, those patients who did get diagnosed with SARS, many of them had their antibodies checked for years to come. And many studies indicated that the great majority of those people still had antibodies 5 years later. In 2012, we had MERS. Do you remember the Mid-East respiratory syndrome? That also was a coronavirus. A couple thousand cases in the Mid-East. We learned from there as well. In between those two, SARS and MERS, in 2009, we had the swine flu, the H1N1. So I went back and found an article that was written by Lisa Schneering, and she worked or wrote for CIDRAP, which is out of the University of Minnesota. It's a highly regarded research organization. And this was August 29th, 2013. And they were referencing back to 2009, to the swine flu epidemic. So this was a brief article. Dr. Mike Osterholm is in charge of CIDRAP, and he is a highly esteemed epidemiologist around the world and has spoken to many of the issues during COVID-19, sometimes with great clarity, sometimes with occasional reversals. And I respect that. When you can say one thing and later on acknowledge that you're saying something different, I think that's important. I think both Dr. Osterholm as well as Dr. Paul Offit, a strong, powerful voice advocating for vaccines for decades, both of them have been willing to do that. But in this article, it talks about the swine study suggests that flu vaccines may sometimes backfire. And it goes on to say this. It says, during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, Canadian researchers identified a greater risk of infection in those who had been vaccinated against seasonal flu. It said the heightened risk identified during the 2009 pandemic threatened to disrupt vaccination efforts in Canada. I'm old enough to remember 1976 during the swine flu epidemic where President Jerry Ford got his vaccine and it was a big public announcement. But literally, because of a few hundred cases of Guillain-Barré and somewhere around 53 deaths, that vaccination program was suspended and never restarted. But going back to this article from 2013 regarding the 2009 swine flu epidemic, Dr. James Crow, a doctor and a microbiologist and a professor of pediatrics at Vanderbilt University and the director of the Vanderbilt Vaccine Center, wrote that the new findings show why health leaders should consider the principle, quote, first, do no harm, end quote, when pursuing new ways to battle flu epidemics and pandemics. Isn't that interesting? His words literally foreshadow what we're dealing with in these very months and time. He added that studies during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic non-neutralizing antibodies. In the last couple of days, Peter McCullough has released this article. And it says this: CDC reports hundreds of Guillain-Barré cases with mRNA COVID-19 vaccination. He goes on to say this: one of the early product warnings came in July 2021, a year and a half ago, with COVID-19 vaccination was Guillain-Barré syndrome, or life-threatening ascending paralysis, with the Janssen adenoviral COVID-19 vaccine. Using VAERS data, Dr. Abera wrote in JAMA, February 1st, 2023, just a few days ago, that 211 cases of GBS or Guillain-Barré submitted from December 2020 through January 2022 occurred with mRNA vaccines, and the symptoms presented 8 to 10 days after taking the shot. Dr. McCullough then goes on to demonstrate the data from the CDC regarding the reports of the Guillain-Barré syndrome after the COVID-19 vaccine. And there's a table of data. This is the CDC data. And this indicates that the symptoms hit 8 to 10 days later, but it also indicates that the type of reporter, in other words, who's submitting the data to the VAERS program, which is run by the CDC and the FDA jointly. And 2/3 of the time, it was being reported by clinicians or the healthcare institution. There has been some comment and discussion as to whether or not the VAERS data can be diluted or compromised or corrupted by allowing lay people to submit the data. But 2/3 of the data, according to the CDC, was being submitted by clinicians and healthcare institutions. These findings indicate, I think, three things that Dr. McCullough points out very strongly. One, the CDC believes VAERS is a solid database. Two, the majority of serious events like GBS, Guillain-Barré syndrome, are reported by healthcare providers and vaccine manufacturers, not patients or families. Three, the FDA and the CDC are not updating EUA FAQs or consent documents, FAQ, frequently asked questions, or consent documents. Thus, Americans are not getting fair, informed consent with COVID-19 vaccination. He also went on to say that Guillain-Barré syndrome is likely to occur with mRNA vaccines and should be tagged as a special adverse event of interest in mRNA development programs. And I'm not in possession of the expertise to speak to that fourth bullet point myself. The bottom line is, when doctors get it wrong, when scientists get it wrong, we need to lean back into the basics. The basics: primum non nocere. First, do no harm. Temper our enthusiasm. Acknowledge our mistakes. I've written 2 books, and in both of those, I have tried to be very clear. I make mistakes. I make mistakes, and I am not interested in giving myself the slack to forget the mistakes I made. I need that self-incrimination to stay with me, to make me better. As we go forward over the weeks, months, and potentially years to come as we discuss COVID-19 pandemic, doctors and scientists need to not cut themselves the slack whereby self-incrimination goes away. We need to hold on to it. It's what makes us better, and it's what allows us to serve you better. Have a good day.